What's going on, guys? It's your boy beatsbyash, back at it again with another banger of a video. And at the time of this recording, we just had the first ever One Piece card game national tournament for North America. And so I felt like it would be no time better than today to go over these top cut deck lists and just kind of give you guys my thoughts on all of these lists that ended up topping the event. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to go to the tournament myself. I actually tried to sign up on the very first day that signups were available, but the event was already at capacity. So it is a little bit irritating that there's still certain gatekeeping mechanisms in the game. I'm not mad about it. Hopefully, I'll be able to go next year and be able to perform at my all-time best for you guys. Now, just for anyone that would be curious about what I would be playing if I was able to go, to be honest, I probably would have chose Zoro. Either Zoro or Sakazuki, in my opinion, were probably the best option to bring to a large event where you're most likely going to face a wide array of matchups, and I feel like that's kind of the best way to prepare for an event at this current point in the game, is to bring a deck that you feel like has a good chance to beat a bunch of different decks across the board instead of just focusing on the top meta threat, because there's so many viable decks in this meta, and even the best deck is not even like 20% better than the other top contenders, and so it kind of leaves the meta very open. But without further ado, let's get into the goo. In the top 16, we had 7 Sakazuki players taking up the majority of the top cut, which is pretty expected at this point. I mean, I said since day one that I felt like Sakazuki was just the best deck. It probably has the highest consistency level in the game alongside Red Zoro. Next up was the Yellow Enel taking up 4 spots, followed by a wider range of decks being 2 Zoro, 1 Katakuri, 1 red-purple Luffy, and 1 Edward Newgate. All in all, it's kind of what I expected, but I am a little bit surprised that we didn't see any purple Luffy players slide into the top cut. I still think to this day that the purple Luffy deck is just all around better than the red purple deck, and I think that the biggest weakness to purple Luffy is just that you don't have a good matchup versus Sakazuki. But I would rather bet on going against a wide array of decks than just going against one deck, even if it is the most popular, because I just don't think you can make those kind of meta calls in the current state of the game like this. But obviously other people thought differently, and to each their own. So let's go ahead and start off with the first place deck list. Yellow Enel winning the tournament, a little bit of a surprise for me. Shout out to Jonas Abraham, the winner of the North American Finals. Big shout outs to you, my guy. Congratulations. This list looks pretty standard. He decided to play 4 Katakuri. I think that's a very fair assessment. Also decided to play 4 Enel. That's something that I do not really agree with. I understand why he would have this in the deck, which is because the card is very pivotal in the Sakazuki matchup, which everyone was just expecting to be the most represented deck, and if you made that call, you would be correct. But I just don't like having a card in my deck that is somewhat redundant across the board in most matchups, but is just very good in one specific matchup. I'm not really a fan of that. And in general, I just haven't felt like the Enel character card has really done enough for me in my matches, but obviously this guy found a way to make it work. He probably went up against a lot of Sakazuki players, I'm assuming, and in that case, he made the right meta call, and there's a reason why he is the national champion and I am not. The other non-standard thing we've got here is 2 copies of Conus, which is the 2K counter for Skypiea. Personally, I just don't think that I would run this. I understand that you're trying to have more names with the Skypiea keyword so that you have a high chance to successfully hit with your Shura search, but I think there's enough high value names that you don't need to sacrifice this slot in order to just play a card that you're really never actually going to play on the field. I guess it probably didn't come up for him. One thing that you'll see in high level One Piece tournaments is that because the game has a relatively high level of variance comparatively to other top TCGs is that people could have weird cards in their deck and still easily find success, because it's very possible that since One Piece cards that have a counter value can just be used as a free discard outlet, they could just get rid of it anytime that the card actually became redundant. In general, in my NL deck, I have a total of 15 Skypiea names, and I think that's sufficient. I think the minimum amount of names you want to have for this Shura Searcher is 14, so I don't think that this is necessary. Lastly, we've got 3 copies of the 200 million V Amaru event, which is the one that gives someone plus 3k during your turn. Then if you have 1 or less life, you can rest someone. It's almost like a Punk Gibson effect if you were an OG of the game and you remember that. Personally, I'm not a big fan of this card. I just don't think in general that this card has a very wide play window. And what I mean by that is, in the first 3 to 4 turns of the game, you really don't want to be holding up Dawn to use for an event that does not generate you a game piece on the board. And so that kind of leaves you in a position where you really don't want to have this card until you're at least at 9 or 10 Dawn. There are so many other cards that have a more wide play window that you could be utilizing in that slot. But obviously, this guy found a way to make it work, so shout out to him for that. I'm still not sold that this is correct, and in general, I'm not really high on events right now, just because at this point in the stage of our game, I feel like characters with an on-play effect generate you so much value that in a lot of situations, you would much rather have an effect that presents value on the board, but also leaves a body behind. And for that reason, I'm just not that high on events at this point in the game, unless it's in like a very specific deck where your deck gains certain synergies or advantages from that event. The way I like to build my decks right now is having the vast majority of cards fulfill multiple roles or purposes in the deck, such as a character that has a good on play but is also a 1k counter. And I just don't like events that have a narrow play window at this point in the game. But let's go ahead and move on to our next deck, the deck that I thought would inevitably win the national tournament, but that's okay. I mean, getting second is a really amazing achievement in itself as well. It looks like he's on the 3 copies of the 4-cost Kuzan, which is something that I've been advocating for since the beginning of the release for OP05. I think this card is just really important against Purple Luffy, or just anyone who's trying to play a late game as well, because when you put this on the board on turn 2 while you're on the draw, if the Purple Luffy player does not specifically have Poly on the following turn and they're not able to remove him from the field, you pretty much just get into an auto win situation, because then you end up removing their 7-cost game piece, which they had to pay 2 life to cheat out on the field, by paying almost no Dawn and using a minimal amount of cards. And so that's why I think this card is just really important to play at least 3 copies of, so that you have the opportunity to mulligan for it in those matchups. Some of the other out of the ordinary things, we got 1 copy of the 10-cost Kaido. I think this card is terrible. Honestly, I think it's a complete brick, and in most situations, extremely win more.
I like the idea of drawing 4 cards. That sounds tight. Do I think it fits in every deck? Absolutely not. Do I think it's like an auto-include in some decks? Absolutely not. Do I want to just draw 4 cards? Absolutely.
I just don't like the restriction of your opponent having to have 3 or less life, because if you're piloting this deck effectively, unless you're specifically in the mirror match, you're almost always going to be up on cards. And if the person is at 3 or less life and you actually have the initiative to be able to take off a turn from developing defensive units or pressuring the other player, then you're probably in a winning game state anyway, where you could just be pushing for lethal. All in all, I just feel like this card is just extremely win more, unless you're going specifically against another Sakazuki player. And in general, I don't like playing non-searchable one-ofs in a game that is not very consistent compared to other top TCGs. I just don't think that that's a good way to think about deck building. He has also opted to play 2 copies of the 3-cost 4K Hina, This is another card that I'm not really a fan of. I just don't think you need the card draw. If you are managing your resources efficiently, you don't really need to get ahead in terms of card advantage. Like, you should already be in that position and you should already be occupying the board faster than the other player. I can understand, like, if you're just trying to completely hedge against the Sakazuki matchup, how that could be beneficial for you, but I just don't think that's a good way to look at approaching the event. He also opted to play 2 copies of Ice Age. I think Ice Age is terrible. If you have any card game experience at a high level, you know that on paper, this card has no effect on the game unless you have another specific card, and I think that's just a bad principle to put this card into your deck for that reason. I don't want to play cards that have no effect unless I have other cards, and I can understand how some people will argue, well, the thing is, I get to draw one, discard one every turn. Okay, sure, you get to do that. So you have a higher level of consistency. So why are you trying to lower your level of consistency when you have a card in your deck that essentially does nothing unless you draw one of your 4 copies of Rob Lucci or 3 copies of Borsellino? There's already so many modifiers in the deck that I just feel like this card is win more in most situations. Moving on, we have a top 4 Chad Red Zoro deck. Got to love to see it. Now let's see if is this guy maximizing on all the searchers. Okay, he's got his Namis, his Dedans, he's got his Buggies, and he opted to play no Ezo. Okay, I don't know why people like to take out 16 searchers from the deck. I mean, that's just a bad deck building principle. That's probably the biggest advantage to actually playing this deck, but we got one more Zoro player, so hopefully he made the right decision. So he opted to play 1 copy of this 2-cost Situational Rush Sanji, which is a card I'm just not a fan of. I don't think the raid is very good, and I don't think that you really want this card because at the end of the day, I don't think that it's correct to be maxing out on the 3-cost Zoro in general. I understand, like, if you want additional copies of a Rush character, that could be potentially good. But if I wanted additional copies of a Rush character, I would much rather max out on the Monkey D. Luffy before doing that, just because I think both of these cards are a much better rate for the amount of Dawn you're paying for versus the 2-cost Sanji. He also played 2 copies of this 1-cost Nico Robin. I don't think this card is really that relevant. This card has some niche implications in the meta, like for example, if you're going against an Enel or a Katakuri and you can pop a 1000 power blocker, or if you're going in Sakazuki, you could pop their Rebecca. I think Vista is just an all-around better card, and it incentivizes us to actually play Ezo, which I think is very important in this deck because you want to be able to maximize your potential to find your 5-cost Marco. I do think it's very strange this guy is only playing 3 5-cost Marco and 3 Buggy, as those are 2 of the best cards in the entire strategy. He also decided to play 2 Diable Jambe, which Diable Jambe is another one of those blank cards in the hand unless you actually have other things going for you. Trust me, I mean, I played the deck as much as anyone and I performed at a high level with it. This card is not good, and the only way you win games with this card is if your opponent is not playing correctly and will just go down to 0 while they have 3 blockers because they think you don't have it. Without that, it's basically just you losing a card. One of the ways that you actually lose with the Zoro deck is by drawing too many events. I don't want to draw a dead card that I can't get rid of out of my hand because we're not maximizing on 4 copies of Marco. We're not playing the 4-cost Marco. We're not playing Fire Fist. So if you draw this card and you're not trying to go for lethal, you're basically screwed. Okay, this is the goo. I like this. I haven't played with this deck like a ton. I've tested it quite a bit online and I just found out that Purple Luffy is just much, much better. But big congrats to this guy because I think that it's awesome that a purple player was actually able to get in there. A ramp player of any kind is a friend of mine. So he's playing 4 copies of Jean Bart. This is a card that we really don't see very often, and I think it's very interesting. Obviously, one of the disadvantages this deck has versus the purple Luffy deck, your leader can't really ramp you until you're on like turn 4 or 5 onward. You do have to play cards that allow you to ramp in the early game in order to actually put out your late game drops before you actually die. So it makes sense to have the Gene Bart. He's also playing 3 copies of the 10 cost Monkey D. Luffy, which I do think is a pretty decent card in this deck. I think it kind of serves the same role as 9 cost Kaido does in the purple Luffy deck. It's a good finisher that when you see it, it can allow you to open up a different potential line of play to close out the game, but you do not need to draw this card in order to win. So I do like the addition of 3 copies of this card. I think that's right where you want to be. Zoro Joro is very standard. 4 copies of Edward Newgate is as well very standard. He did opt to play 2 copies of the new 2-cost Fire Fist, which I haven't really seen this card played very much, but I do think it's a little bit better in this strategy, as you have a better play window of actually triggering the second portion of the effect. Considering you're already starting off at 3 life, you can pretty much get that effect live on command. Overall, seems like a nice list. Definitely interested in trying this out. Moving on to the top 8 deck lists, we have Andrew's Sakazuki deck, and it looks very similar to Jackson, and it looks very similar to the second place Sakazuki list, so nothing really here to talk about. He just changed up the ratios a little bit, playing 2 copies of the 10 cost Kaido, also playing the Hina. You already know I don't agree with those, so let's move on. All right, we've got another Enel deck list here. Let's see if there's anything different in this one. This deck list looks pretty similar to the winner, but he did opt to play 2 copies of Charlotte Linlin, which I'm a big fan of. I generally just see this card as having a much wider array of applications than the 7 cost Enel, so I definitely like that inclusion. We've also got the 4 cost Charlotte Katakuri, which is one that I've been playing myself. I think that this card is live more often than you would think, and this is currently probably the deck with the best fit home for it. Considering you get to start with 4 life, but you actually have 5, you're really not taking any disadvantages to make Charlotte Katakuri live from the beginning of the game. So really like that. Overall, I think I like this list quite a bit better than the first place list, although I'm still not a fan of the Conus or the 2 million volts. We've got our second Enel deck in the top 8, and this person is opting to play 4 copies of the Charlotte Pudding Searcher, a card that I'm actually playing in my personal build. I actually really prefer playing both Searchers, as I feel like the Big Mom Pirates cards that you see played in most Enel decks are, generally speaking, just some of the best yellow cards in the current card pool, and I don't think you have to have that high of a number of targets in order to guarantee your searches to hit more often than not. This guy is not playing the Skypiea Searcher though. He is playing 4 copies of Charlotte Perospero. As you can see, he's going really heavy on the Big Mom Pirates package. I'm currently not playing that card. I just don't think you have enough justification with not being able to manipulate your life in the same way that you can with Charlotte Katakuri, and I don't think that the look at 3 search is, generally speaking, nearly as good in this deck where you cannot play the 10 cost Big Mom. Now, he is playing the 2K Charlotte Amande. I just don't think this is a very good card. Yellow has some pretty decent 2Ks to choose from, so this is one that I probably would not choose to include, especially since they're just way better options. Other than that, everything else is pretty standard from what we have seen thus far, but definitely an interesting list to say the least. Moving on to our last deck within the top 8, we've got another Sakazuki player, and he is opting to play 1 copy of the 2K Virgo. I feel like that's a little bit random, and I think the deck is very tight. He's only playing 2 copies of the 4 cost Kuzan. I'd definitely like to see more of those. It seems like everybody is playing at least 1 copy of the 10 cost Kaido. I guess everybody just wants to hedge for that Sakazuki matchup. He's playing 2 copies of the Sanji's Pilaf. Alright, everything I've said about the deck thus far goes out the water whenever this guy flips Sanji's Pilaf from the life for game. This guy's deck is based. He is based. Enough said. Base deck, enough said. Sakazuki in general, cringe. Sanji's Pilaf, very based. Now we've got our first deck in the top 16, which is another cringe Sakazuki player. Looks like he's playing one copy of the blocker 2K Bartolomeo. I don't know what it is with everyone just running these non-searchable one-ups today. Bartolomeo cringe. There's really not a lot to say about Sakazuki in general. There's such a high amount of core cards in the deck that you really can't change, and that's like the biggest disadvantage to this deck. The customization seems like it's high at first look. Then when you really look at how many cards are actually high card quality, you quickly realize that you can't really mess around with that many slots in the deck. I mean, he is only playing one Sabo. He's playing one Sabo, guys. He's a meta crafter. He's changing up the game. We've got our first NL player in the top 16. He opted to play the Charlotte Pudding Searcher as well as the Perospero package. He's going 3 Charlotte Linlin, 3 Katakuri. I think that's okay. You can run into some issues if you clog with too many big drops. He also played the 2 copies of the 4-cost Charlotte Katakuri, which we are a fan of on this channel. And everybody is just playing this 2 million volts card. He also played 3 copies of Thunderbolt. I'm not really a big fan of Thunderbolt, to be honest. I feel like it kind of just diminishes the utility that you have being able to sit at 1 life if you already drew this card. Overall, pretty standard deck. We finally have a new deck in the mix, Charlotte Katakuri. Now, I was a big fan of Katakuri when it first came out. I quickly realized I don't like playing the deck when other people are also on the deck because the mirror match is straight up cancer. But I do think that it was a good pick to run this deck at this event just because I feel like the amount of people who were playing Katakuri previously has vastly diminished, and I think that puts this deck in an amazing spot. The biggest advantage this deck has over a Nell is that you can run the highest number of cards that allow you to trigger summon themselves from life versus any other deck in the game. And a lot of games with Katakuri come down to, oh, the guy summoned a 5k power character out of his first life. Okay, I automatically lose the game, and it's definitely something to be taking advantage of right now when you aren't seeing as many Katakuri players in those tournaments, so you're not going to go into those cancer mirror matches where it just comes down to who drew more 10-cost big moms. But this guy is playing 1 copy of the 7-cost Enel. I do not think this card is very high power level in general, and I don't think this card has a lot of merits being in the deck without having the Skypiea Searcher, as I don't like non-searchable one-ofs. He's playing a mini Skypiea package without the Skypiea Searcher, and I just think the ratios are very weird here. 1 Gadatsu, 1 Enel, 2 copies of 2 million volts, 3 copies of Satori. I think that's just strictly incorrect. Like, you pretty much always just want to max out on all of the guys who are 5,000 power and summon themselves from life. And the fact this one is a 2k counter, I don't know why you would not include 4 copies of this, because that's basically just a free slot in the deck, and Satori is probably the best 2k in the yellow card pool right now. Once again, we find ourselves with another Sakazuki list, and it doesn't look like this guy is doing anything different at all. In fact, it looks very similar to the second place list that we previously looked at. In fact, it might actually be just exactly the same list. I don't know, maybe these guys are friends. I'm not really sure, but nothing to look at here. And now we return to another Chad Zoro player. Let's see if this man got it right. All right, so he is once again not playing the Izo Searcher, but he is playing 4 copies of Buggy and 4 Marco, so I can at least respect him for that. This is somewhat of a similar approach as the previous Zoro player. I guess the main difference is this guy opted to play the 0-cost plus 3k counter in the deck, which I just don't think is necessary when you already have the best defensive event in the game, and I don't think you want to have that many events. This card is good because it lets you get rid of dead events, which is one way you can lose the game, but at the same time, it's another event that if you just draw 3 events in your opening hand, you're not going to be able to play the game because you can't apply pressure. All in all, I would not consider taking this list to a major event. I hate to show this on my channel, but we've got a cringe Whitebeard player who made his way into the top 16. Very glad I didn't go to the event when there would be degenerate Whitebeard players in the mix, but this is a pretty different list. So he's playing 2 copies of this 6-cost Sanji. I've literally never seen this card in my life. If your opponent has a character with 5k or more, this gains rush this turn, so it's 6 for a 6k conditionally. I don't like that at all. That just seems bad. Like, I understand that it's 2 more copies of Monkey D. Luffy. At that point, I personally would rather just run copies of Rush Zoro if that's what you're trying to do, because at least with Rush Zoro, you're guaranteed to have that keyword active no matter what, and it's not conditional like this. And as well, it's just a generally speaking better rate, because you could pay 4 Dawn in order to make your guy 6,000 power with Rush. I understand that you really like the 1k counter in this deck, but I'm just not a fan of that. It's honestly very cringe. We've also got 2 copies of this Jinbei that is from the same starter deck 10. Never seen this card before in my life as well. 2 cost for a 2,000 power 2k. Give up to one of your opponent's characters minus 2,000. Okay, I don't know why this is in your deck. You're never putting this on the field. I don't know when you're actually going to want to invest a Dawn to attack with this and gain the effect, because this guy isn't even playing Vista, which is one of the best cards to have a solid interaction with this Jinbei. And as well, you can see he's not maxing out on 5 cost Marco, which is as well cringe, because this is still one of the best cards in the game if you have forgotten. As well, he only played 3 copies of Guard Point. This is not what we are used to seeing. I mean, more power to this guy for getting there with this deck, but also L's in the chat because he played Whitebeard. Whitebeard cringe. Now, our last deck we're going to be taking a look at is another Sakazuki, and let's see if this guy is actually cooking for once. Okay, no. He's actually just using almost the same list card for card as pretty much everyone else who was in the top 16 on this deck. One thing that you'll notice about this guy over the others is he's not playing the 10 cost Kaido, but other than that, everything he's doing is extremely standard, and I can at least respect him for not playing the 10 cost Kaido, because Kaido is in fact cringe. But in general, there's nothing really to say here, just switching up the ratios. Looks like everybody is on Ice Age, looks like everybody is on Hina, and those are 2 things that I'm not for. That's gonna wrap it up for these deck lists today. Hope you guys enjoyed this content. If you're wondering why there's been such a long break since the last time I uploaded a video on this channel, it's because I actually got deeply sick for several weeks and was in fact coughing up blood for quite some time. But now I'm back to full health, and I've been good for a couple of weeks now, but because I was debilitated for so long, it took me quite a while to actually just catch up on my work and uploads for other channels and other brands. Finally, I'm in a place to where I can start posting more card game content again. I know I told you guys I would be releasing a gameplay video for Zoro in my last upload, and I just haven't been able to get to a local tournament. But now that I can, I'm super excited to get that one done. You can also expect to see some Yu-Gi-Oh content coming. I'm really excited to be recording some old school Yu-Gi-Oh videos in specific. Thank you so much for getting this far in the video, and as always, if it's not the goo, it's got to go. Peace.
Ooh, is that indigo?